The Steady State Sentinels, produced by the Steady State, a community of former national security professionals who spent their careers safeguarding the United States, at home and abroad.
Today, we continue that mission by staying true to our oaths to defend the Constitution,
uphold our democracy,
and protect our nation's security. Join our expert hosts as they interview field-tested guests whose unique experiences shed light on the crises and challenges facing our nation.
I'm Peter Mina, a civil rights and federal employment law attorney, as well as a former Department of Homeland Security official who worked to integrate civil rights and civil liberties protections in the department's national security programs, and you are listening to the Steady State Sentinel from the Steady State. We are facing an existential threat, growing autocracy in the United States. The Steady State Sentinel is a place where we and our distinguished guests use our national security expertise to discuss and analyze the decisions and acts of this administration that feed that autocratic slide and threaten to supplant the pillars of our constitutional democracy. Today, we're talking with two distinguished guests, Bill Braniff, the Executive Director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERIL, at American University, and a former director of the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships of the Department of Homeland Security, and Dexter Ingram, a former director of the State Department's Office of Countering Violent Extremism and former director of the Office of Preventing Weapons of Mass Destruction Terrorism, as well as the founder of In Network, a nonprofit aiming at guiding young minds aged 13 to 26 towards fulfilling careers in national security. I'll be talking to them about the risk they see for radicalization and domestic terrorism in the current political landscape, and what those risks mean for the future of democracy or a possible slide towards authoritarianism. Welcome to the program, Bill and Dexter.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
Great. So why don't we start with a little bit of your origin stories? And Bill, why don't I start with you? What drew you to national security and more specifically prevention of terrorism, both here at home as well as abroad? And I know, Dexter, that may be more your domain having been at state, but just kind of want to get a little bit of how we got here.
Sure. Thanks, Peter, and thanks for having us. So is fairly common. I was an idealistic young person. I was curious about what I was really made of, and the idea of going to West Point and finding out, what I was made of, and also being able to serve seemed like a good idea. I had, a grandfather who served in World War II and with all of his brothers, and grew up really in a sort of patriotic environment, I suppose. Why prevention? I've actually this is a quick anecdote. I've been in a lot of different roles in federal service. So I was a cadet. I was a U.S. Army officer. I was a GS employee at the National Nuclear Security Administration. I was a Title X U.S. Army civilian on the faculty at West Point, and then a member of the Senior Executive Service. And so I really only ever wanted to be a public servant. But what kind of public servant has been the journey? I started off as an armor officer. I was a scout platoon leader in an armor battalion on 9/11, and needed to figure out what had just happened. So I'm very much part of the 9/11 generation that became part of the counterterrorism community, and was proudly a part of the counterterrorism community for a long time. But I'll be honest that 10, 11, 12 years after 9/11, I got very frustrated that we were still trying to kill and capture our way out of the threat, recognizing intellectually that, of course, that wasn't going to work. And so I started looking for something different. How else can we try to decrease risk? And at the time, I was in a leadership role at the University of Maryland's START Center, which is a terrorism research center. And I was fortunate to be on a couple projects with other really brilliant scholars who were looking at how we can learn from fields of mental health and education about how they think about violence prevention around 2013, 2014. So I sort of stumbled into this idea of a public health informed approach to targeted violence and terrorism prevention through the research at START, and then was fortunate enough to be able to bring that to life at DHS for a few years.
Excellent. And, and that's where, we cross paths. So that was a real pleasure working with you. And obviously, thank you for your service. And so let me turn it to Dexter. Dexter, give me a little bit of, give our listeners a little bit of your origin story.
Sure. I saw Top Gun when I was in high school, and I was like,
classic.
Yes, I want to do that. And I ended up, going to college, getting my commission in the Navy, and going to flight school, earning my wings, and flying E6 TACAMO missions. This is all in the 90s. So before 9/11, I got out of the Navy, and I was at a think tank, really focusing on weapons of mass destruction, because I thought, these are threats that are so big that, coming up with solutions afterward or mitigation afterwards is kind of just behind the curve. So that was a really fascinating piece for me. 9/11 happened, and I got a phone call to lead the terrorism, science, and technology policy for the brand new House Select Committee on Homeland Security. So I went from the military to think tank to Capitol Hill. And then I got a phone call from the State Department. They were creating a team to stop terrorists from getting weapons of mass destruction. So I went there and created that team. That was really worthwhile because we had some really unique partners back then. Russia was our co-chair. But we just got to do some fascinating things. And from there, my counterterrorism kind of bona fides went to Afghanistan, speaking Pashto in Helmand province, came back, worked at the FBI for a bit. Then I spent some time at Interpol, 3 years, kind of running their counterterrorism team, focusing on defeating ISIS. Came back, led the Defeat ISIS team at the State Department. And during this process, there was so much just happening in the U.S. We'd come out of COVID. We saw a lot of people spending time online. We saw this polarization when it came to just, I guess, a lot of things that were being fed that could be misinformation or disinformation. And I was taking that personally. I'm a dad. I have 2 young boys. I'm a Black man. And when the Office of Countering Violent Extremism had an opening for a new director, I applied for it and I got it. And for me, it was one of the, if not the most personally satisfying and professionally satisfying positions, because you got to really focus on learning a lot about the different groups, both domestically and internationally. But I think that looking at ways to prevent these acts of violent extremism was something just very unique, and it was very challenging. I got to work with Bill over at Homeland Security, got to work a lot with the White House, work a lot with our international partners. So that's been my journey.
Excellent. And so actually, given both of your extensive service, and I should start with thank you. You both have done tremendous service for this country. How have you seen that government service or government experience, particularly in the prevention space, translate into your work either in the private sector or, Bill, I know you spent a fair amount of time and you currently are in academia. How has that time in government helped you?
For me, I will say that a lot of the things that I did overseas, whether it's in Afghanistan working with tribal elders, you realize that the community and those personal touches and understanding the specifics matter. And in my local community back in the U.S., I came back and I was PTA president and involved with like creating farmers markets and those kind of things. And there was so much commonality there. And I really was focused on youth radicalization. So many young people between the ages of 15 to 24 are radicalized, whether it's ISIS, whether it's neo-Nazis, or whether it's aspects of the manosphere like incels, and committing violence. So kind of talking with the community, talking with teachers, talking with other parents, there was just kind of a natural flow there, especially after leaving the government.
Excellent. How about you, Bill?
So, so many ways to think about that question. one note is that I've had a lot of similar jobs, whether I was adjacent to government at a research center like the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, or START at the University of Maryland, or now Peril at American University, or on the other side of the fence at in a practitioner or job, relying on research and evidence to make informed decisions. I've always sort of straddled the fence professionally between the intellectual academic community and the practitioner community, and that's just been such a exciting and just frankly cool place to be, because you're sort of translating back and forth between the research world and the real world, and trying to create evidence-based practice that best serves the American people and best mitigates risk. And so interestingly enough, I think that even my jobs in academia have been public service jobs. My jobs in government have been very intellectually rigorous and academic. And that to me has been very satisfying. Military service teaches you a heck of a lot about the importance of diversity, the importance of being able to navigate uncertainty. I think I'm very confident navigating uncertainty and still being able to sort of make decisions and move forward. Whereas I think a lot of folks who haven't been in uniform or in intelligence-led law enforcement, where you're making your best informed judgment in a given moment, but you don't have perfect information, you don't have clarity, you don't know exactly what the future has in store. There is inherent risk in the things that you do and the things you don't do, and that kind of gives you a little bit more comfort in leadership roles, trying to lead organizations through uncertain times outside of government. And I think that's perhaps the thing that's most valuable to me. The other thing I'll say is that I've been at research centers, three different, I think, really elite research centers, surrounded by brilliant academics. And as brilliant and elite as those organizations have been, the government organizations that I've been a part of have been equally inspiring. The people have been equally expert and competent and impressive, with incredible backgrounds. And so I think that one thing people maybe don't understand outside of the government is just how competitive and high performing our public servants are. And I think that's one of the casualties of what's happened over the last year, is that we've allowed public service to be vilified, when in reality, these are competitive roles filled by highly competent, highly qualified people who should make America proud.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think public service is, the highest profession there could be, and it requires the best and the brightest. So we've been talking a lot about the terms prevention. We've talked about radicalization. The three of us have sort of been in this world for some time, but for your listener out there that, for whom this might be the first time they're, kind of really engaging with these topics. Bill, let me start with you. Could you just kind of give, the Reader's Digest version of, like, how would you describe prevention? And maybe, in that context, what does radicalization mean?
Sure. Look, I think there are three legs to the risk reduction stool. I can engage in intelligence-led military and law enforcement disruptions of already mobilizing bad guys. I can engage in physical security, anti-terrorism measures to decrease the vulnerability of targets, or to deflect violence away from high priority targets to low priority targets. Or thirdly, I could prevent individuals from ever getting to the point where they want to mobilize to violence in the first place. And that's what prevention is. It's a series of upstream programs designed to decrease the likelihood that someone gravitates towards violence. And it, as a result, really opens the aperture for who can be engaged in prevention. Parents can be engaged in prevention. Educators can be engaged in prevention. HR specialists at a workplace can be engaged in prevention. Schools, of course, are massively important. And so the way we applied, the way we thought about prevention over the last several years at the Department of Homeland Security is that we basically adopted, 30 plus years of evidence and practice from the public health violence prevention community. So briefly, we've been doing violence prevention and injury prevention as it relates to suicide, violence against children, intimate partner violence. We've been doing that professionally in the United States for over 3 decades. And we know a lot about what works to decrease the risk factors for violence in someone's life and to increase the protective factors that mitigate against the likelihood of violence in someone's life. But we never bothered to those professionals, hey, do you think it would work with hate crime? Do you think it would work for someone who winds up joining a domestic terrorist organization? Do you think it would work to prevent the next school shooter that's motivated by an individual grievance? And so what we did is we sort of picked up that domain of knowledge and put it down around targeted violence, premeditated violence. And sure enough, we found that it's really effective. If you can do early interventions, decrease risk factors for violence, increase protective factors that buffer against violence with these multidisciplinary interventions, very similar to what you do for a suicide intervention, you can absolutely decrease the number of people who gravitate towards violence, who go all the way down that rabbit hole. And it was incredibly rewarding to implement these programs through state and local partners while I was at DHS. And to just give you one data point, because I think it's important for people to understand exactly how real this is. Through our grant program, we funded 1,172 interventions for an average cost of $6,900 per intervention. And we were 1,172 and zero in terms of violent outcomes. These were individuals who had made threats of school shootings. These were individuals who were stalking congressional leaders. These were people who had assaulted other individuals or who were fixating on a school shooting or a previous attacker. These were real threats, and we were able to do interventions that averted millions of dollars of criminal justice costs, like investigations and incarcerations, and tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of societal costs associated with violence, right? These are very, very costly incidents when they occur. 1,172 and zero. So prevention is possible. We know how to do it. We just need to invest in it.
That's incredibly powerful. Dexter, anything you want to add there, given your vast expertise, and I know you're coming at it from a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, prevention is something that I think is extremely important, right? This is vital, but oftentimes when we work with partners overseas, prevention is something that's hard to measure. Bill domestically had grant programs, and he worked with people that were highly at risk and did a wonderful job. Internationally, we have a number of programs and organizations that do great work, but as certain leaders kind of say, okay, show me the numbers, we can talk about the money we spent, how localized it was, where it was in the world, and how nothing happened, meaning there is no violent extremism that came out of these programs. But they'll ask, well, is that because of your programming or not? And that's where the rub is sometimes. I've seen that with both administrations, to be honest. And I will say that as we look at key program, I remember a program specifically focused on children in Syria. And at one point we asked them, how many of you see violence as a way or a solution to solving problems? And about 75% of the children said, yeah, violence is a way that we can solve a problem. And after the programming, and this is a pretty simple program, it's age appropriate. It's kind of like PBS programming to a certain extent, but really focused on the issues. And they would come back and about 30% would say that. So that's measurable, right? That cuts it in half. And these are really simple, straightforward type of things that make big differences. So much of this is at the community level, at the local level. These aren't necessarily huge national programs. When you look at preventing terrorism or violent extremism, this is something the U.S. can't do alone. It's like climate change. You got to have partners. You got to have these coalitions, which are super important. And everybody brings some different expertise to the table. I was fortunate enough to have a team that also focused on the subnational level of governance, meaning like mayors.
Right.
And when mayors talk, they're really focused on outcomes. There's less politics, less international kind of back and forth. They find so much more commonality. It could be mayors that have had huge recent influx of immigrants, and the local response to that initially was fear. It could be hatred. It could be looking at them as others, but then kind of working through that and sharing success stories and solutions with other mayors, whether it's in the U.S. or Ukraine or anywhere in Europe or Asia. We've seen a lot of success. So I'm a huge fan of the prevention piece. For me, looking at, as they say, eradicating hate, stopping hatred, that fear of others is at the core of it for me. We see so many people that don't experience others at a level. And Bill's an academic. I really am like just that people person who connects with our partners overseas and domestically, and Bill does too. But I will say that as you kind of get to know folks, whether they're Jewish or Muslim, we've seen so much anti-Semitism, so much anti-Muslim hatred. The LGBTQ plus community, there's been so much hatred there as well. Kind of talking it through and seeing young people who might even have legitimate grievances initially. It's dating scary in this day and age. And when you look at issues related to finances and jobs, the economy, there's some issues there that we can talk about. They all go to the internet. They all go to the internet and they look for solutions. And those solutions normally benefit them in the first 2 months or so. These are positive things. They're working out. The character's getting, kind of developed a little bit more. Their confidence is growing. And then the algorithm kicks in and it starts taking them down roads where it highlights others and starts blaming others for any kind of key problems. And that other could be women. It could be anything. And it takes a few folks down that road to the point where violent extremism is the outcome. And unfortunately, we've seen that many times domestically and internationally.
I feel like we could have a whole separate podcast on the role of social media in this space. But you're actually leading me, both of you are leading me to sort of my next question, which I apologize in advance, maybe a little bit multi-part or at least multi-contextual. So given the administration's, what I would say, inexplicable kind of de-emphasis of all the programs you both are talking about in favor of a more traditional law enforcement focused approach, how do you see that shift as potentially, making us less safe, increasing the possibility of radicalization? And then, thinking about that shift to law enforcement, how effective is that when you don't have for example, as it relates to domestic terrorism, there is no domestic terrorism statute. There isn't even an agreed upon definition of what domestic terrorism is. So maybe, Dexter, if I could start with you, how do you see kind of that landscape playing out as we're living it right now?
Yeah, it's interesting because if you look back at the most recent intelligence assessments, over the past few years, it talked about the biggest threat domestically basically being far-right extremism. And that's something that isn't political. That's intelligence that is actually, grounded in numbers and put together by experts. I know we don't talk about that anymore in this current administration. Another key issue was racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism. That's basically white identity terrorism. And again, that's not something that is even labeled in the current administration. The first Trump administration, they are the ones that came up with that terminology. They were happy to have programs with women, peace, and security and REMBI related and CVE aspects of prevention. And all that's gone away. All the women, peace, and security work is gone. All the prevention teams that made up the U.S. government, from CP3 over at DHS to the FBI's teams that focused on this, to the State Department's Countering Violent Extremism Office, as well as our Global Engagement Center and Foreign Influence teams. Anything that dealt with misinformation, disinformation is basically gone now. It's not funded. I think, it was last week where the administration actually said, we're going to disengage from a number of international organizations that focus on issues related to prevention. And we created a lot of these organizations. We, seeded the money for a lot of them. But luckily, there are other international donors, because the world does see this as a threat. And they our partners see this as important. It shouldn't be a political thing. And, my fear is, now that we're really lacking on the prevention front when it comes to engagement programs, offices, and expertise, you're going to see everything as a nail in the hammer, and it's everything going to be kinetic. And what also is going to happen is the grievances over the next few years are going to grow because they're not being addressed by prevention programs. And 2 or 3 or 4 years, you're going to have a number of things happening. And the sad part about that is it's going to get politicized. You'll hear people say, well, that didn't happen under our watch. Well, what happened under the current watch is nothing. So it is going to blossom and bloom, in a few years. And that again, shouldn't be politicized. I look at the fear of ICE and what's happening in our communities right now. You have folks at the local level that don't want to call the police when a crime's been committed. If there's a medical issue, they're not going to want to report that either, because they are afraid. And when our communities are afraid, there's just overall less reporting. And most of the reporting that we get when it comes to crime and other issues come from our communities. So we're kind of doing the opposite of what we should. I say this not as a law enforcement expert, even though I spent 3 years at the FBI and 3 years at Interpol, kind of leading teams. It's as I talk to my friends who literally led ICE in different years over the past 5 years or so, not one of them says what we're doing now is what we should be doing. They all say this is not what we should be doing, and we're doing this the wrong way if we want to accomplish certain things. And that's not political. These are former heads of ICE. So it's really an interesting time for me, and it's great to be able to talk about these issues with you and Bill.
Absolutely. And having come from ICE myself, though certainly not in a law enforcement capacity, I can absolutely relate to what you're saying. And ironically, you mentioned women, peace, and security. Then member of Congress, Christine Ohm, was actually one of the sponsors of the Women, Peace, and Security Act. And now, unfortunately, it has been discarded kind of across government. So, Bill, let me turn to you. How do you sort of see these issues? And Dex mentioned, immigration, and I'm just kind of wondering, you and I were talking a little bit before we started recording, sort of a little bit about, for example, the public statements from ICE, Department of Labor, and others on social media. How do you kind of see all of this kind of maelstrom kind of, materializing, and how do we respond to it in a way that's meaningful?
Thanks. Let me begin to answer this question by actually addressing the last question that you posed to Dex. First, let's just look at what's actually happened as we've reduced our investment in prevention of terrorism. And I would actually argue, as we've taken a lot of resources away from our law enforcement counterterrorism approaches and put them towards immigration and border security tasks instead of counterterrorism, we've seen a massive increase in attacks and credible plots in the United States from the last year of the previous administration to the first year of the current administration. And I'm talking about like a 40% increase in attacks and credible plots in the United States. An increase in the success rate of those plots. About 55 or 54% of these plots succeed. 150% increase in fatalities in the United States from the last year of the last administration to the first year of this administration, and a 700% increase in injuries. So it turns out if you remove federal resources from these important missions, prevention and counterterrorism, the trend lines go in the wrong direction, and American communities experience more violence. So that's sort of thing one. Thing two, if the only resources left, even if they're reduced, are law enforcement resources, and yet there's no domestic terrorism statute, where does that leave us? Excuse me, there's no punitive domestic terrorism statute that can be charged. Well, it leaves us with a discrepancy between the average duration of a sentence of a domestic terrorist perpetrator versus an international or someone inspired by a foreign domestic terrorist organization. So the average incarceration for someone inspired by ISIS or Al-Qaeda is just under 14 years. The average incarceration time for an individual who's associated with domestic terrorism is less than 7. It's at just over 6, just over 6 years. And why is that? Well, because they're not being charged with a 20-year material support for a terrorism, offense kind of charge. They're being charged for an assault, a battery, a drug charge, an illegal firearms charge. Much, much lower sentences. And again, that 6 years is the average, which means many, many sentences are 1 or 2 or 3 years long. And so it's really not even a risk reduction strategy when we use law enforcement only approaches to disrupt domestic terrorism. What we're doing is we're delaying risk by, a handful of years, but we're actually adding risk factors for violence to that individual. They've now been incarcerated, they have a record. It's harder for them to get a job. It's harder for them to have a positive pro-social personal relationship. It's harder for them to increase their educational attainment. It's harder for them to reintegrate into society. So they are often welcomed back into the arms of the violent extremist movement when they get out of prison. And so a law enforcement only strategy for domestic terrorism is wildly problematic if we're actually trying to reduce the risk of recidivism of violent offense. So that's sort of the first part of the question. What we have seen is that these counterterrorism and prevention resources, prevention resources are gone domestically. CP3 does not exist. It was fully dismantled by September of this last year. What we've seen is a reallocation of counterterrorism resources to immigration enforcement. And in the backdrop of increases of ICE checkpoints and detainments in U.S. cities, is this social media feed that you mentioned, Peter, this idea that out of Department of Labor, Department of Homeland Security, and then in things like ICE job advertisements, we're seeing explicitly neo-Nazi, Nazi, and white supremacist propaganda coming through official communication channels of the U.S. executive branch. That is incredibly chilling and concerning. And for those who might, sort of think that this is sensational, we're seeing posts that feature white supremacist anthems sung by the Proud Boys, like "We Will Have Our Home Again." We're seeing references to a book written by a neo-Nazi who is a member of the National Alliance. The book is "Which Way, Western Man," which talks about sort of the white race needing to pick a white nationalist future. We're seeing references to the Great Replacement theory, this idea that there's a conspiracy to intentionally bring in immigrants to lower the level of power of sort of white Americans. Often this is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory in which the Jewish population is orchestrating this immigration, which is why we saw incidents of violence like the Tree of Life shooting, targeting the Jewish population for supporting immigration into the United States. But it's also the motivation behind the Tops Friendly Supermarket attack in Buffalo, New York, and the El Paso Walmart attack. So these are some of the most lethal mass casualty attacks in U.S. history on those populations. This is, not an accident. Like, you don't have songs, you don't have memes, you don't have slogans. You don't have actual references or paraphrases of Nazi quotes appearing across the executive branch social media feeds by accident. And so it's clearly indicating that what ICE is doing, this focus on immigration and border security, the reduction of immigration from dozens and dozens and dozens of countries around the world, the attacks on DEI programs and diversity in the federal workforce and any organization supported by the federal workforce. You add all of this together and you get a really chilling racial cleansing platform. And as a former peacekeeper in the Balkans who kind of became a professional adult thinking about ethnic cleansing and what balkanization and identity politics can do to a country, to see a concerted series of efforts really intended to racially cleanse the United States is wildly chilling.
Well, speaking of chilling, I as important as this conversation is, I'm sure our listeners and I feel it too. It is chilling to sort of talk about the realities of what's happening out here. So you sort of with that backdrop and kind of just the general instability of what's happening in the country, what do you see as the possibility of foreign terrorist organizations taking advantage of this environment to radicalize people here in the United States? And again, what does that mean in terms of the overall risk of terrorism or other forms of targeted violence? Dexter, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I see it as a bit of opportunity. We don't name something that's a huge threat, there's a problem. When our national security strategy doesn't mention white identity terrorism, there's a huge problem. When we're doing things like, trying to designate groups like Antifa, when, there are bigger issues out there, I think that's a problem. I'm just constantly amazed because what we used to see, right, where these kind of attitudes at the local level, we call them hooligans, right? If you go to Germany or the UK and you're at a football or soccer match, you have these hooligans who are drinking too much, they have these beliefs and they act out. And we see that now becoming more culturally attuned as well as more politically. Like these political parties are popping up in Europe, and we've also seen, a right-wing focus domestically as well, and it's getting more organized. If you look at folks like, look at the Groypers, right? You look at the Groypers, that's a political movement. These are neo-Nazis who, they're anti-Semites. They believe in the Great Replacement theory, and they're sitting down and they're talking with our political leaders and having conversations in rooms they would never previously have access to. So a lot of that is becoming more culturally, quote, acceptable. We'll see people act out in different ways. Maybe it gets them fired from their job. Maybe it gets them socially isolated, but they have the right of freedom of speech, right? Where the line crosses over is where they commit violent extremism. That violent piece, that word violence is the key here. With social media, you have manifestos and information being shared in ways that never was shared previously. Before it was like, who's in your local community? Now you can be on Discord, Roblox, or any aspect of social media and be connecting with somebody in Europe or South America, Asia, anywhere, and be a part of this group that initially starts to, build a community with you and make you feel at home and have really simple solutions for you for really complex issues. And that's the beginning of the radicalization process. It's so much easier now. And as we see this develop, we can't go to social media companies and say, take that down. What we can do is say things like, this violates your terms of service, and we're going to highlight it for you. But what they do is what they do. I look at X, for instance. This isn't violent extremism, but X has had Houthis selling arms openly on their platform for years. And X is making money off of these sales, and the Houthis are making money, and these are verified accounts. It's this process of, I think now especially the government saying, we're not going to say what's the truth and what's not the truth. That misinformation and disinformation, hey, everybody has a point that should be valued, and we're not the arbitrator of that. I think there are certain truths and there are certain untruths out there, and finding ways to build trust and get people to understand that and be heard is only good for our communities and our society. So I'll leave it at there. I can go on.
Thanks, Dex. And so what I'd like to do is, first, Bill, I'd love for you to, kind of jump in on that as well. But then my final question for both of you is, kind of two-part. So the first is, given what you just said, Dex, and certainly just the context of the conversation we've been having. I mean, look, my family's Egyptian. I'm brown. My kids are brown, and I wonder, given all of the threats that you both just laid out, what should we be doing? I mean, just at the basic family and community level, what do we do? And then I think sort of in that, broader context, Dex, you mentioned, obviously freedom of speech, and, there's the issuance of NSPM 7 and how, that has sort of fomented the sort of use of almost casually the term domestic terrorism. What does all this mean for the potential slide to authoritarianism? And sorry, I realize it's a lot in a couple of questions, but wanted to sort of, bring this to a kind of a crescendo, because it's a really, really important conversation and one we could certainly talk about for hours. Bill, why don't I start with you?
Sure. On the question of are we more vulnerable to terrorism, there's lots of reasons to think that the answer is yes. Not necessarily because terrorist organizations are going to capitalize on this domestic moment any more so than they would capitalize on any opportunity at any point in time, right? Terrorist organizations are opportunistic. When they have the ability to engage in an act of violence and they think it makes sense, they'll do it. So I don't know that we're changing their necessarily, but what is 100% happening is that we have eroded our international cooperation by removing tools like USAID, the damage that's been done to the Department of State and their ability to partner with allies overseas, our national security pivot to the Western Hemisphere, our threats against Greenland and by extension NATO. There's all sorts of things that we're doing that are decreasing the international ability to engage in international counterterrorism effectively, and that makes us more vulnerable for sure. On your second question about, gosh, this is concerning. What do we do? What do I do at home and in my community? It's really important to understand that there are so many things that we can be doing in terms of prevention of targeted violence and terrorism. The organization that I lead now focuses on primary prevention. This is upstream prevention. So this is the kind of stuff that parents and schools and faith leaders and state and local governments can be engaging in. And so I would encourage people to look at the Peril research website for some of those resources. It's sort of too long of a list to name, but what we have to first understand is that 80% of school shooters tell someone they're going to do it before they do it. North of 50% of mass casualty attackers leak their intent, say that they're going to do something before they do it. We have to take that information seriously when we hear it. Ask a caring question to that person. Bill, are you thinking about hurting somebody? What's really going on? And then get that person access to someone who can help them. Targeted violence and terrorism, these things are preventable. We all have a role to play. And it's normalizing this idea of prevention, I think, is one of the most important things we can be doing, as opposed to just falling victim to the apathy and saying that, geez, this stuff is inevitable and it's ubiquitous and there's just nothing to be done about it, right? That is the worst thing we can be doing. And instead, what we need to do is sort of be proactive. So Lots of things to offer there, and I'd love follow-on conversations with anybody who's actually interested in like what are state and local prevention opportunities. We do a lot of work with state governments and local governments, and would love to continue that conversation. Um, in terms of National Security Presidential Memo 7 and this slide towards authoritarianism, I would just encourage listeners to understand that this isn't some scary imagined future scenario. We're talking about before this winter break, the Department of Justice issuing a memo asking for a list of domestic organizations that should be investigated for promoting things like anti-traditional American values. That's a subjective term. There's no basis in law for it. There's a reason we don't have a domestic terrorist organization list. It's a wildly slippery slope towards authoritarianism and cracking down on normal political rivals that exist in a democracy and should exist in a democracy. And so, with National Security Presidential Memo 7 and then the follow-on DOJ efforts, individuals need to understand that this is an existential threat to American democracy, to civil society, and we have to speak up.
Next, you get the last word, and I would love to hear, as I was describing my background, you mentioned you're a Black man, you've got 2 Black boys. What do you tell them?
Yeah, I have to have tough conversations with them, where their friends can go out and, their parents are saying, boys will be boys, or they're just being cheeky. I'm like, you can't do that. You have to be held to a higher standard. You can be perceived as older or more of a threat than you actually are. I know you're 10 and 13. There have been a number of cases where I can't even get into it. I mean, there's literally thousands of cases of police being called on young Black men for just kind of living their lives. And so that's something that's always there. I also tell them it's their superpower because they are more attuned and more alert, and they're not just going la-di-da through life. They're being intentional about what they're doing and who they are. So I kind of spin it and say that's your superpower. You see things others don't. My boys are also very international. I mean, I remember during the last Trump administration, when I was at Interpol, meeting with the leadership from the White House. I met with Tom Bossert and well, I'm not going to name my other friend, but and they would say, we're the globalists. And it was me and the Secretary General of Interpol, and I would have to explain to the Secretary General what that meant. That they believe in international cooperation and America's place in the world. Those are good things, right? When you villainize, just international cooperation, and I always tell young people, learning different languages is great. Having a passport is great. Traveling is super important. And there's different religions and there's different food. And it doesn't mean it's better or worse. It's just different. And the more you understand that, the more you'll see we have in common. Everybody wants the best for their kids, right? There's so much we have in common internationally, but we have this tendency to villainize folks. And I see that especially at the international level. And that also applies when you have immigrants coming into the U.S. I personally think that within our communities, we see a lot of people kind of pushing back. We see different, religious leaders kind of organizing and talking about, the commonalities that we have. It is amazing to watch people like Stephen Miller talk the way he talks. And I literally feel like I'm back in 1943. Not that I was alive then, but I'm a big student of history. It really is amazing. And a lot of times people say, well, they're not coming after me right now. They're not targeting me. It's a slippery slope. It goes down all of these. It doesn't matter. Maybe they target the trans community or immigrant community at one point, then it's literally the door is open for anybody. And you have people, there's a number of YouTube videos out there of people who voted for this current administration that say, I never thought this would happen to me. This is unfair. I didn't realize this. And I think that a country should basically, the worth of a country, the values of a country really come down to how it treats its most disenfranchised, right? It's poor, it's sick, it's children, it's elderly, it's immigrants. And that says, the core values of leadership and what that country stands for. And I feel like we're failing at this moment. But as I look at my nonprofit and network and all the young people that want to get involved in national security, I see hope. I see smart, passionate hope. One of the cores that I tell them all is that if you're going to be a part of a network, you got to be a good human. Can't be a jerk, can't be selfish, can't be focused on yourself. Always focus on the mission and connecting with others and doing what you can. And that provides me hope.
Well, picking up on that hope as a child of immigrants and former feds and, with kids of my own, I hope that we can all hang on to that as we go through this really difficult period in our history. So thank you so much for joining us, Bill and Dex. Really appreciate you having here. Such an important conversation. Could you both just briefly tell our audience where they can find you?
Go ahead, Bill.
Sure. Thanks. So again, I'm the executive director at Peril at American University, and our website is Peril Research, one word, perilresearch.com. Resources are available there. And also the editor at large for prevention at Homeland Security Today. So happy to talk to you about publishing articles to help continue the conversation on prevention, which is incredibly important for us, given the 2.6 credible plots and attacks per day in the United States. We've got a lot of work to do. So would love to see you contribute articles, and I'd love to publish them for you. Thanks.
Dex?
Yeah, I'm the founder of In-Network. That's in-network.org. It's a nonprofit basically focused on getting more young people of all backgrounds into the national security world and just overall service. I'm also the author of Codename Citizen, a Substack that really touches on these exact issues. I have articles coming out every Monday, do a bunch of lives. And, I'm available on LinkedIn because I'm happy to speak. I just came back from Ohio with over 300 police officers talking about these issues. And it was good to see them start to understand it. So thanks so much for having us, Peter.
Of course. So if you like what you heard on today's show, please subscribe to the Steady State Sentinel wherever you get your podcasts and give us a 5-star review on Google. Those subscriptions and 5-star reviews help us get this important content out to the widest possible audience. The Steady State Sentinel is for you, our listeners, and we want to hear from you. Please join us for our next episode so you can stay engaged and stay informed. Remember, protecting our democracy isn't a spectator sport. This is Peter Mina for the Steady State Sentinel, still standing watch.
Thank you for listening to the Steady State Sentinel podcast. Don't miss out on more insights and exposés from America's premier global security experts.
Also, subscribe to our Substack at substack.com/@steadystate1 and follow our social media, and join us right here next week for another exciting edition.
The Steady State is a nonprofit organization working to sustain our democracy and national security.
Join us and support our mission by visiting www.thesteadystate.org.